Hey everyone, welcome back to Coachy TV. This video we're going to start a new phase of the season, continuing to talk about planning out your cross-country macrocycle. Now we're in the third part of the season in which you have workout. It's actually the fourth part of any macrocycle or season, and that is the pre-competitive phase. This is where basically the hardest workouts of the season are going to be happening, and it directly leads into your competitive phase, or sometimes called your championship phase, when the most important meets are going to be. And you know, typically you would think of that as like your state meet or something like that. For some people, if they're maybe trying to get to the state meet for the first time in a while, maybe it's the regional meet. So it kind of depends on your team and your situation what the most important meets are. But that competitive phase is going to be directly fed by the pre-competitive phase that comes right before it. So that's an important thing to kind of understand. Where this plays out, it really does directly lead into, like all these do, but really directly leads into what that most important part of your season is, that competitive phase, and how you time out the pre-comp phase. So we're going to be looking here at what adaptations do we want during pre-comp, and what are the timetables for these adaptations, because we want to obviously directly feed into that competitive phase, and we don't want to do it for too long or too short to most effectively support that competitive phase of the season. This is our boys cross-country team from last year. Just after the Class 4A state meets, it was our fourth straight trip to state. So this was a group that actually lost 4 of our top 7 varsity runners, including our number 1 runner from he had been the number 1 runner actually for 3 straight years and was a top 10 runner for 3 straight years in our state. A young man named Trey Rivers, who's currently running on a cross-country track scholarship in college right now. So this was a very challenging year for this group, because we lost our number 1, our number 2, our number 3, 4 guy, and then our number 7. So this was a group that really had to peak during the regional meet to make sure that we got to the state meet. So that was kind of the idea of that year, knowing what we needed. Now we did lose 2 young men from this team, Jackson right here and Alex right here. We've added some really nice kids along the way, but we brought back a lot of our team this year too. So I might be looking at things a little bit differently. For my team, you may have a team that just wants to get out of districts for the first time in a long time. Before our streak of 4 straight trips to the state meet, the team I'm working with here, Wharton High School, our team hadn't made it out of districts from 2009 to, I believe it was 2016. Yeah, whatever 4 years before 2019 is. Yeah, 19, 18, 17, yeah, 2016. So it was 7-8 years there. We didn't even make it out of the district meet. So that's an important thing too, basically knowing what your team is, what the goal is, and make sure that they're at the best. And that's what the pre-comp phase is really going to directly support. I'm Kyle Jochner, the head boys cross-country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida. Have been for the last 7 years. If you'd like a closer look at some of my credentials, they are on the screen. So obviously we're dealing with the cross-country part of the season right now. Most of the world is getting ready for the cross-country season that hopefully will be mostly complete here in the, I'm coming to you from the United States, obviously Tampa, Florida, but wherever it is that you're coming from. So the metrics here for the 5K, because we have to understand what makes the race up before we figure out how to peak for the most important parts of the season here by getting ready in the pre-comp phase. So this study that was released by Ingham in 2008 looked at a lot of different things, including why does somebody win the 5K versus not win the 5K, looked at a bunch of different things, and they found that if you had the better VO2 max, or basically you could use the most oxygen at workout intensities, you won 94.3% of the time in the 5K, as sure a thing as you can possibly get in racing. There's obviously other things that are going on there, but that's almost a sure thing. If you can run the fastest aerobically, it basically is what that means, you're probably going to win the 5K at that point. And, you know, obviously whoever's in second place probably has the second best VO2 max. There's going to be a little bit of shuffling in there, but just again, anecdotally, I mentioned this in a previous video. If you think about your kids who do, you know, your 2-mile test is how I recommend testing velocity at which you reach VO2 max. You can also do a 10-minute time trial or something like that too. But basically, think about your team. Whoever wins that is probably going to be first place for your team at almost all of your races. Same thing with second, third, and fourth. If that gets flipped, it's because something happened. Maybe your number 1 had a bad day or they were sick or something, but most times VO2 max is going to very accurately tell you who wins and then who comes in second, third, fourth, and so on in a 5K. Another reason for that comes from us from the USA Track and Field Distance Curriculum, which would tell us that the 5K is run at 97% of your VO2 max. So just a little bit slower than VO2 max makes sense, 3.1 miles. One of the best tests of VO2 max is 2 miles to exhaustion. So that very close association between VO2 max pace and race pace in the 5K is one of the big reasons why that percent is so accurate for winning the 5K. And then looking at energy race supply, and this is important, this is only when done at race pace. If you walk a 5K, this is not going to apply, but at race pace, study that was released by Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, they work very closely with the IAAF. When they looked at the 5K, they found that 4% of the energy came from the ATP sitting in the muscles, and then the phosphocreatine system recharging that ATP, the fastest way of recharging energy, and we collectively call that the alactic energy system. The anaerobic glycolytic system, that system that is the second fastest recharger of ATP, and it's also the one that can potentially cause acid. Well, it's the only one that does produce acid, and then acid could potentially accumulate if this energy system is working too fast for too long and not being kept in check with proper race pacing and a good aerobic system. Supplies 10% of the energy, which is a very sizable percentage here between the two anaerobic ways of recharging ATP. And then, not surprising, the aerobic system supplies 86% of the energy at race pace. Again, no surprise here because of this close association between VO2 max, which is a fast pace, but is still the fastest aerobic pace, and everything in terms of success in the 5K. And the law of training specificity seems simple enough, but something that is important to keep in mind that every training session has a specific effect on the athlete, which may or may not be good for that event. So the idea being is the perfect workout for the 800 may hurt you in the 5K, and the perfect workout for the half marathon may hurt you in the 5K. And vice versa. A great 5K workout might negatively impact you in one of those other races. The event is very specific. The training is very specific. And your athlete is only going to be adapting to whatever you're giving to them, either if you're training yourself or a team or whatever. You do a particular workout, you're going to get a particular result in that athlete. The body is only going to respond to what you're given. One of the ways to thinking about this, I live in Tampa, Florida. We're not going to see 60 degrees probably until maybe October. If I were to go to some place that gets a lot more cold weather, I would not be adapted. The cold would hit me a whole lot more. Say someplace, maybe North Dakota or something like that. Somebody who, vice versa, lived in North Dakota would come down here and really find it challenging to even do just normal things outside here in Tampa, Florida, because most days it's, the low temperature might only get down to about 80, 81 degrees, so it's a really challenging thing. So my body here in Tampa, Florida is going to adapt very differently to somebody up in North Dakota, even though we're maybe doing the exact same workouts, simply because there's another effect that's happening on the body based on the training because of the difference in the weather pattern. So kind of think of it that way. Just because you're running, just because you're training doesn't mean you're getting yourself better. You need to know the demands of the race, this idea of training specificity, and also the athlete themselves are going to play a part in this too. A pretty big part, so you have to keep that in mind also. So, the phase objective here in pre-comp. We want to stress the appropriate adaptations needed for cross-country 5K success at the highest level. That's the important thing. We've always been stressing these adaptations. In general prep, we were really working on aerobic system and then the alactic system. When we got the specific prep, we added all three. But now we want this to be at the highest level. And the reason for that will become apparent as we get a little bit further. So as I mentioned, every macrocycle includes 5 parts. That first part is the transitionary phase where no actual specified training is going on. This is the rest and recovery in between the different phases. People should not be bedridden. We're dealing with active people, but this is I recommend 3 to 4 weeks in between, say, your cross country and your track season and vice versa, which then leads into your general preparation phase. This is your summer training in cross country. I have a whole video series I'll put in the description down below, and in that phase, you're simply preparing for more intense work. You're getting the aerobic system and the alactic system with specific strength ready for more intense work later on, leading directly into the specific preparation phase where we specifically prepare for the demands of the race, and it should really say almost all the demands of the race, because this is where we also add in the anaerobic glycolytic system, that 10% of the energy, and then we're stressing them at the appropriate levels for where they are, right? But then when we lead into pre-comp, we are preparing for the most important meets, and this is where we really have to stress them. This is the current phase that we are talking about right here. And again, I'll explain why we have to be stressing. All the things that we were stressing in specific prep are still being stressed in the pre-competitive phase. By the end, a couple things start to fall off a little bit, and there's specific reasons for some of those training stimuluses to start to go away by the very, very end of this, but you're training everything in pre-comp. You're training hills, you're training plyometrics, you're training alactic, you're training VO2 max, special endurance 1 and 2, you're training all of those different things, easy pace, tempo pace, all those things are still being trained here in pre-comp, but by the end, some of those things do start to go away in favor of things that are really going to directly impact your championship meets here. And so that's what we're looking at here in pre-comp, and then that again directly leads into the competitive phase. Big time races, most important races, what you did in pre-comp is directly supporting it. So obviously things that we did way back here in general prep and even the rest and recovery are going to have a part in the pre-competitive phase, but I mean in the competitive phase, but the pre-comp phase directly leads into the big time races. If you mess something up here, if something goes wrong here, it's really going to directly impact the competitive phase or the championship phase. You make, a mistake or do something a little bit off down here in general prep, while obviously all these things add up, it's obviously not as big of a deal as a misstep here in the pre-competitive stage, simply just because of that close association here. There's a bridge, it's step 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5, and then you repeat the process the next year, in this case, which would be the track season. So that's where this all fits in. And then this energy continuum, this is based on percent of VO2 max. This is from the USATF distance curriculum. This is where we find that VO2 max. Let me just throw all this up on the screen, actually, now that I think about it. This is where we find that VO2 max is very closely associated with performance in the 5K, because the 5K is at 97%, the 10K is at 92%. If we were running the 10K, it would not be nearly as close to that association with VO2 max. It's important, it's part of it, but the association with success in the 10K is more something called running economy, which is directly related to more of a lactic threshold. So that's the idea of training specificity, changing things here. All the things that are circled basically are all the different trainings that we've been doing before. I mentioned this already. Aerobic threshold, still important. Lactic threshold, still important. Extensive tempo and VO2 max aerobic power type workout. Intensive tempo, special 1 and special 2, and anaerobic alactic system. All of these things still apply. But some of these things, as we mentioned, by the end of it are going to start to fall off a little bit. But everything that was important still is as we enter here the pre-competitive phase. All right, so this graph kind of best talks about how these things are all directly sort of impacting each other. The idea of the aerobic system and the anaerobic system develop at different timetables, right? So the aerobic system here is in red, and the anaerobic system, really should say the anaerobic glycolytic system, because this really isn't the anaerobic alactic system we're dealing with here, is here in this orange color, okay? So this is not 100%, to scale, perfectly, because everybody's going to do this a little bit differently, but sort of in general, this is the way these two systems have a timetable of peaking. As you can see, the aerobic system is sort of more of a gradual sort of incline. This makes sense because this is dealing with body structure changes, bigger heart, more capillaries, things like that, building mitochondria. And then it starts to level out here at about week 20, as you can see. And then there's still some improvements that happen, but it starts to level out for, out to week 24, 25. You can hold it for, 26, 27, maybe 28 weeks. But you can see there's a much more gradual incline with it, and then that kind of peaks out. The anaerobic glycolytic system has a much more quick approach. It improves much more quickly than the aerobic system does, and the reason being is this is based on something called buffering capacity. It's neutralizing acid that can be developed with the anaerobic glycolytic system to reduce or delay fatigue. So the idea being is this takes much less time to develop than the aerobic system, because it's simply things like storing base type products in your muscles so that you can better deal with the acid, or neutralize the acid in reality, so that you can have better performance in this way of producing energy. And then after about 9 weeks, it starts to level off. 9 to 11 weeks is typically the peaking window, and then it really levels off for about a number 3 weeks. You can hold it for 14, maybe 15 weeks, depending on the person. If we were to start training aerobic and anaerobic system at the same time, say this is the first week of your summer training back in June or whatever it is you were allowed to start, then you would have the aerobic system, say, I don't know, this is probably sometime in August. You've got a fully developed anaerobic glycolytic system, end of August, beginning of October, and then this system would start to go downward. The aerobic system has not peaked out. This is why you have some people that do, reasonably well in, say, September time frame, and then they don't quite get back to that performance or don't really improve for the rest of the season. It very well may be because they started this type of training too early. What we want to do is we want to slide this orange anaerobic glycolytic window to more like, week 10, 11, 12, something like that. The aerobic system's already got something to develop, which can actually help support the anaerobic glycolytic energy production. And then this system will catch up, and then this will be peaking out here, hopefully at your most important meet, which would be potentially the state meet. What we're dealing with right here is kind of in this range. Things are really peaked out. You've got, say your last couple weeks of improvement, say week 8, 8, 9, 10, and 11 or so, maybe out to 12 of your anaerobic glycolytic system. And then same thing here with your aerobic system. This is like maybe week 18, 19, 20, something like that in that time frame. So basically you've got a pretty well-charged aerobic system. They still have more to go because you're going to be doing some more work. And you have a pretty well-developed glycolytic system if we did all that timing correctly to where they're peaking at the same time. What that means is you have a very, very fit athlete that is ready to really get some hard work on them. They have a very well-developed aerobic system, a very well-developed anaerobic glycolytic system. You've hopefully been doing alactic work to also support both of those things going on. So now they are prepared for this very intense work of the pre-competitive phase so that we can get that last little bit, get them to maximizing all of this so they can be in tip-top shape by whatever your most important meets are. That's how this all sort of plays out leading into the pre-competitive phase. However, just because they're ready for something doesn't mean it's the right time of year for you to do something, right? I mean, they might be prepared for a really good, say, mile test or something like that, at a point in the season when it really isn't advantageous for them to do it based on the sort of bigger picture. So why exactly does pre-comp have the hardest workouts? Well, the key is basically in how humans adapt to training, okay? There's obviously variations in how humans do things. We're not little robots running around, so obviously there's variation here. But in general, adaptation takes 2 to 4 weeks, and that's a pretty big window. Some people adapt a little bit more quickly. Some people take more to adapt, and it could be that you can maybe quickly adapt to aerobic if it's your particular genome and everything that makes you up, and maybe you adapt more slowly to anaerobic work, and vice versa. It's a little bit different, but in general, most people take 2 to 4 weeks to adapt to something. It's why I recommend doing your VO2 max test or so about every 3 weeks or so, something like that, kind of right in the middle, kind of capture that adaptation as best as you can so you can increase the training, increase the stimulus when they're ready for it so you're not wasting a lot of time. And in track season, it's why I would also every 3 or so weeks do some version of a 400-meter test. I would not do that in cross country, but it's the same idea of tracking anaerobic growth. Small adaptations definitely happens within that window, right? Because it's not like you flip a switch, but for full adaptation, we really should be thinking about this overall time frame when we're thinking about full adaptation of some kind of training stimulus. So, with that in mind, if the hardest training is done 4 to 8 weeks before the most important meets, and this is typically when this would be, right? If your competitive phase is, most textbooks say about 4 weeks. I like 3. I just think it's better so that you don't detrain certain aspects of the aerobic system. But, a 4-week competitive phase definitely fits in with what the literature says. I just find for my situation, it doesn't necessarily always work out great. And then you've got a competitive phase, which is about 4 weeks. This is really what we're dealing with here with the competitive phase. 4 to 8, I could have put 3 for my situation, but whatever, 7 to 3. This general time frame, weeks before the most important meets, then the adaptation from these hardest workouts that we're going to be giving to them will directly support performance in these races, right? So if the hardest workouts are in this phase, this 4-week phase directly before the championship phase, that 3 to 4 week window, well, now these adaptations that you're giving to us during this is really going to directly support performance in these most important races. So the hardest workouts are going to be happening right here in pre-comp because they're going to support your performance in these most important meets when you really have to be on all cylinders. Now, this does bring up some important questions, especially for us in Florida. One of the biggest meets of the year is FSU pre-state is what they call it, because it's where the state meet has been for the last bunch of years. It's right in the middle of pre-comp, and I really don't want to take my foot off the gas before these important meets. You probably have a really important meet in that 7 to 8 weeks before your championship race, your state meet or whatever, that's really important probably to you because it's when everybody's really fit. Just keep in mind, are you peaking for that regular season meet or are you peaking for the championship phase? And if you're peaking for that regular season meet, then you have to back everything out, right? Because you're not going to be totally peaking for that regular season meet if you haven't really thought about it. So, you can take little sort of things. If it's a really important meet, maybe a day or two ahead, you take your foot off just slightly, but you got to be careful because what you do in pre-comp is directly leading to what you're going to be showing able to do in that competitive phase. So definitely keep that in mind. This is when we really stress the anaerobic glycolytic system here in pre-comp, right? Tons of rest. We're talking workouts that give you 10, maybe even more minutes of recovery to make these super high intensity. This is special endurance 1, special endurance 2 at its best, at its highest. This is, you're going as fast as you possibly can and you are basically replicating it several times because of all of this rest. A lot of times a kid might think, hey, isn't it more intense if you're giving me less rest? I'm like, absolutely not. You can't go as fast, right? Like, you cannot stress your body the way that you can when you're super fresh, and I'm having you do 3, 4, 5 reps almost as fresh as you can be because 10 plus minutes, the acid is going to be mostly gone. You can pretty much hit close to that the next couple times, right? So in pre-comp, we are stressing the absolute daylights out of the anaerobic glycolytic system. It's very, very high intensity for the acid buffering capacity to develop. And we're also obviously learning how to run at a very fast ability, fast-paced running. That's an ability that has to be sort of taught. It started early on in the season with the alactic fly 30s, hill runs and that kind of thing. Special endurance 1, I recommend you spike them up so it's as fast as you can go. Special endurance 2, I do recommend doing barefoot in a park so you get that sort of strength from the foot muscles too, but they need to be going fast on these anaerobic glycolytic workouts in the pre-comp phase. This is we are really stressing this energy system. However, volume cannot slip too much, as I talked about. If it does, we're going to lose aerobic ability, okay, when we need it most. The aerobic system is still supplying 86% of the energy in the 5K. We want to get the 10% of the anaerobic glycolytic system as good as it can be, but this is still king, right? So this presents an obvious training paradox, this idea of high intensity, relatively high volume, because if we drop off on the volume 4 to 8 weeks before the most important meets, well, now we've detrained that aerobic system. We do not want that. We need the aerobic system going as strong as it can in the state meet, if that's where you're getting to, or whatever your championship meet is. But we need this system to also be going on full cylinders. So that brings up this obvious point of the relationship between volume, or miles, and the intensity in a training year. And basically there's three basic relationships that you would probably be dealing with here in this part of the season. There's obviously one here that's more of the rest and recovery, right? So we've got high volume, low intensity. We've got high volume, high intensity. We've got low volume, high intensity. And like I said, the transitionary period would be low volume, low intensity, because you're not doing anything really that's in a real general phase. So those are the 4 ways you could do it. But for training purposes, these are the 3 main ratios that you deal with. And we'll start with high volume, low intensity. The goal is to jumpstart the aerobic system adaptations with this type of training for both meet performance, right, because the aerobic system is still king, and it does support the intense work later on in the macrocycle. This is to help support the anaerobic glycolytic system. As we've talked about in previous videos, the aerobic system clears some of the acid, a lot of the acid from the anaerobic glycolytic system, so they work in tandem. The anaerobic glycolytic system supplies the hydrogen ions that fuels the aerobic system. The aerobic system clears it so it doesn't accumulate too much. So this really does 2 things. It's meet performance, and it supports more important or more intense work later on. This is associated with training plans during general prep, right? And early specific prep. Even early specific prep isn't all that intense either. Danger potential here is relying too much on long, slow distance workouts. Don't get too far away from fast running even now. This is why you still do your fly 30s. This is why you still do your hill runs. This is why you still do even tempo runs. I mean, that's a medium pace workout, but it's certainly not. It's certainly faster than long, slow distance, and it's why you still do your VO2 max for other reasons too, but you don't want to get too far away from fast running. I've got a whole video series on general prep running that'll be in the description down below, and on specific prep that is also be in the description down below. Let's talk about low volume, low intensity. Goal is to peak both the aerobic and anaerobic systems and reduce overall fatigue associated with training. We'll talk about this more when we get to the series on the competitive phase, but if adaptation takes 2 to 4 weeks, we're not going to be getting a lot of adaptation associated with training plans during the competitive phase. So really what we're doing a lot of this, the peaking window is a lot about allowing fatigue to fall off. You're still doing some to the aerobic and anaerobic glycolytic systems. The alactic system really never peaks out, so that's why I did not include it with those other two. And we'll talk about that more, but it really is talking about a lot of the fatigue falling off the athlete. Danger if this is starting it too early. This is, again, why I allow 3 weeks for this instead of 4, because obviously detraining takes 2 to 4 weeks. You don't want your kid allow if you do it too early, the aerobic adaptations from high volume to regress. We've talked about this in a previous video too about knowing your why. Boys and girls, men and women, deal with a reduction in volume very differently. A lot of times we might think that men or boys can handle more volume in the peaking phase. It's actually the exact opposite. Video in the description down below on knowing your why, where I talk about some of this, and I'll go over it in detail here, but men get a lot of their strength, men and boys get a lot of their strength gains from testosterone. It peaks out when workouts are actually reduced for a period of time. So boys and men actually benefit from a bigger reduction in volume than girls and women do, who rely more on their strength gains from HGH, which is actually most stimulated at its highest level with more work, essentially. So girls and women actually can handle a little bit more volume in the competitive phase than men and boys can for peak performance. But we're not talking about that now, just sort of a snapshot of something later on. High volume, high intensity. Goal is to maximize acid buffering capacity. We talked about that before. We're maximizing this system while not allowing the aerobic system to begin to peak just yet, right? And therefore, we're going to prevent that detraining if we do it for too early. So that's why the volume is so high. That's generally associated with aerobic adaptations, and the intensity is generally associated with anaerobic work, right? Specifically, intensity with acid buffering capacity, which is what a lot of these workouts do. This is associated with training during pre-competitive phase. It could be also associated with late specific prep because that's directly leading into it. But that's where we're kind of dealing with here. This is where you're going to have high volume, high intensity. There is a clear danger here, though. Okay, well that makes a lot of sense. If you're going to rob Peter, generally you have to pay Paul, that type of thing. The idea is you go somewhere with it, right? Higher volume, lower intensity. Something, if you think about that as a scale, it can, when you do this, you put more on one, it doesn't get out of sync, right? If it goes the other way, low volume, low intensity, well now it's, it's sort of fine. But if you load up both ends of those scales, the scale could potentially break, right? That's not what we want to have happen here. So the clear danger point here is overtraining, okay? So we really do have to take care in terms of balancing it. Now, obviously, these are aerobic kids. These are aerobic monsters typically in cross country. So things like long runs and recovery runs are probably never going to be where the issue is. But by the end of this is why things like maybe your tempo runs and some other types of training that are going to be less directly impacting your performance, they take a lot of time to make these adaptations, start to fall off here by the end of this this training phase, so that you can really focus on the things that are going to directly impact your championship season. So that's sort of the idea here in competitive phase training and how it fits in with the rest of your season, your general prep, specific prep, and your competitive phase of the season. All right, so the workouts during the pre-competitive phase, if you've seen a lot of the videos, this slide's not going to be too earth-shattering, except there's going to be some special notations at the bottom for the pre-competitive phase. So the critical workouts are still the same as before. We've got our long runs, we've got our VO2 max runs, which includes testing, and cross-country kind of also includes the race, and our recovery runs. These workouts are critically important to success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. They focus on improving VO2 max, both the central and the peripheral. I have a video in the description down below that talks about the differences between those two. Here's the new note. Aerobic system is still king, but much of the work has already been done. Keep what's built. That's what we really want to do here in the competitive phase. We started this back in, if your state meet, ours in Florida is hopefully going to be on November 7th. So if you started training back in, whenever your state allowed, we were allowed in my county to start June 15th. You may have started earlier if you were allowed, maybe the end of May, something like that. Small changes built up over those 20 plus weeks, right? Bigger heart, more capillaries, but they're slow building. So by this point in the season, we've done a lot of what we're going to do. Obviously, we're going to get more adaptations, but what we really want to make sure we do, we definitely need to make sure we keep what is built with these critical workouts that we've been doing all season, right? The long run, it's not going to be quite as long as you were dealing with in general prep or specific prep, but it's still pretty long, right? Same thing, we're still going to be doing VO2 max testing and runs and recovery runs, but we definitely want to make sure that we keep what we have developed. Important workouts are still the same. We've got alactic runs, hill runs, strength runs, and our tempo lactic threshold runs. These workouts are still very important to cross-country 5K success, but less so than the critical workouts. They focus mainly on running economy, which all three of those do. Tempo runs really specifically, as well as specific strength. The alactic and the hill runs are the specific strength aspects. Now, specific strength and economy are still important, but the adaptations take very, very long. If the aerobic system takes 20 or so plus weeks, running economy takes years to develop. It's the longest thing that gets better. It just takes years and years of running. It's just why if you have, videos of people, if you coach high schoolers as a freshman down to when they're a senior, they just look much more smooth. Their body, as they do more of it, gets more economical going from one place to the other, and it takes years for this to happen, okay? Very, very long time. So you've made some changes in this season, but the economy changes because you've got cross-country and track, and then the next season, and the next season, and that's where you really see the differences. Same thing with specific strength. The alactic system never really seems to peak out. It's really about that whole strength aspect and the hill runs and things like that. They take a long time to get better, but they don't really seem to peak out. It's why we do all of this all the way through general prep too. So they take a very, very long time to improve. Or we can say the aerobic stuff just take a long time to improve. Some of these types of workouts, alactic, hills, and tempos, and really all three of those will be ended for your macrocycle, or recommended that you end them for your macrocycle before the end of this pre-competitive phase because of what we were just talking about. You're still going to be working on economy in everything that you're doing. Every time you're running, you're becoming more economical with it. And every time you're running, it's a strength run, so you're always developing specific strength when you run. We're just not directly targeting it. So because you're still doing these things, those aspects that you've worked since general prep are not really going anywhere. You're still going to be working them, even if you're not directly targeting them. Now, quite important, we've got Special Endurance 1 and 2, and I'm going to put a plus next to that because we talked about this is really what we're working a lot on. Intensive tempo, we talked about that's really special endurance type workouts, but less intense. At the very beginning of pre-comp, you might be doing those, but not so much anymore. And then extensive tempo, really that would just be if you want to make sure that you don't want to go more than a bunch of days. An extensive tempo workout might be good 2 days before a meet, like I mentioned before, your FSU meet. It's still a workout that's going to be targeting the anaerobic glycolytic system, but it's not nearly as stressful as a true special endurance workout. So if you had to do something like that because you had a meet that it's that one meet that just everybody needs to, it really is a confidence booster or something like that, and not really lose too much by not doing a super, super hard workout, that would be the extensive tempo, and that's why those two have question marks next to them. These workouts cause improvements in the anaerobic glycolytic system, exposing the body to acid. They focus on creating adaptations to buffer this acid, reducing or delaying fatigue. We talked about this a little bit. This is when these workouts become very demanding, and that's hence the plus sign next to Special Endurance 1. We've talked about this already. Lots of rest, super intense, they're going to be potentially swimming in acid if you want to think of it like that way. They really need to be able to, they're swimming in acid, but they're able to buffer the acid. They've got the ability to buffer it at this point because of everything you've done through general prep, through specific prep. They've got an aerobic system to support it. They're strong, so they're going to, use as much as they can from the alactic system, and they've got a good running economy going on. They've built up all of these other things to where these workouts can be very demanding, and they can do them very effectively, and they can do them very safely. You would never jump right in and do these in general prep. No way. It's not safe. It's not effective. They've been working for, 14, 15 weeks, something like that, from the beginning of your general prep. They can now handle this type of work. And I've kind of spoiled the answer to this question, which do any of these workouts stop in pre-comp? Well, they absolutely do. Some adaptations take very, very long time. As we talked about, the alactic system specific strength never really go into a peaking window, but training them at this point of the season will create little to no benefits due to the long nature of these adaptation timetables. I mean, they're going to get a little bit better, but even more of the work has been done, even more so than the aerobic system. Some workouts also create a strong delayed fatigue, which can really hit them when they're trying to do other more intense work later on. And it's an even longer fatigue than I think people realize. Plyometric work, okay, so this is this type of stuff that we do, I recommend before your Fly 30 alactic work, before your hill work. Primary fatigue is just afterwards, right? Obviously, you're fatigued right after a workout. But for some reason, there's a bigger secondary fatigue that comes 8 days later. And why that is, who knows, micro traumas to the muscles or whatever, but there is a big secondary delay that's even bigger than the initial fatigue that comes about 8 days later. It's funny, I have a group of kids that, if you've seen the videos that we have in the description, in the, the workout videos we did one on Fly 30s where they were just absolutely crushing them for basically 2 straight weeks, which is very plyometric in nature. And then a couple days later, we did a hill workout, and it was still a good workout, but man, the fatigue was apparent on them. They were hitting times that they were doing the week before, but you could just see they were struggling a lot more. They were talking about soreness, and it was probably because of the secondary window of fatigue hitting them. So we don't want this to happen in really important workouts, important meets that happen in pre-competitive phase. So this starts to go away. Same thing with hill runs. The fatigue is similar, that secondary fatigue. But it's even more so, especially with these long hills. Video in the description down below on long hills transitioning between, you do these at the end of specific prep and the beginning of pre-comp. Long hills are the most demanding workouts you do. If you keep doing these for too long, you're going to overly stress, you're going to overtrain either yourself or the athletes you're working with. So that's why those start to fall off by, say, the second or third week of the pre-competitive phase. Some adaptations regress very slowly, right? Some strength training, and this kind of goes along with the idea of specific strength with, those alactic Fly 30s and the hill runs. Some strength training, i.e. resistance training or weight training with either, weights or medicine balls, they really don't regress all that quickly. A lot of the research shows that, basically even 6 weeks without it is really going to show no real lack of training. So I typically stop doing, our weight room routine pretty much the last week of pre-comp, because I have a 3-week competitive phase. I've got, if I do that, it's 4 weeks. I think that's in the safe range. They're not going to be developing all that much more, and they're not really going to be losing anything in that time frame. So it's not really going to regress. So that's why I would start to reduce these workouts, definitely. Come up with your own timetable, but that's why I do what I do. These should all be present. All these things are still present at the start of pre-comp, but they will start to reduce and ended by the end of the phase. So that's all the information, all the data on this type of thing. Let's go ahead and see what it might look like on a fictitious macrocycle to conclude this presentation. All right, so this is the whole fictitious macrocycle we've been dealing with in all the videos we've done on general prep and specific prep. I recommend a 5-week specific prep phase just so that you can get yourself really ready for the more intense work here in pre-comp. And here's what we've got here, at least for our situation, if you're developing yourself toward a our state meet, which is on September 7th. It might be different for your situation. 4 weeks fits really nicely here with this. Third complete week in September. Typically, it's September, October type training. I would recommend, at least for my situation, again, it's going to be a little bit different based on what your competitive phase is getting yourself ready for. It might be the regional meet, district meet, or your state meet might be on a slightly different week. This idea of starting it here toward the end of September. And as I mentioned, long hills, which we started here at the end of specific prep, are still present here at the end. And I think I mentioned in that video, the race that I've been talking about, FSU, would be right here the first weekend of October. There's a lot of hills on that. It's not really a long hill workout, but it sort of almost serves as our last hill workout before the state meet. So I would say 1 week for pre-comp, 2 week for pre-comp. And if you look here in October, this would be, that was the second week here with the FSU pre-state, and again, sort of serve as long hills because of the course. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, our county championship, which is also our conference championship. We actually have the 7th biggest school district in the country here in Hillsborough County. It's the county that includes Tampa, Florida. So we have 27 public high schools and a number of private schools that also jump in and do our county championship. So that's the 3rd week. And then 4th week, we have no racing. We've got a week in between our county championships and our state series. And then we get into the pre-competitive phase, which would be here, and then, as I said, that first weekend of November. The 3rd week I have for pre-comp is when our state meet is hopefully going to be right here on November 7th. So this is going to directly lead to performance, as we said here in the the district meet, the regional meet, and the state meet, just because of the timing here. Now, depends on your situation. We said you might be in a situation, like I said, where districts is what you're shooting for. You just want to get to the regional meet. Then you would want to push all of this stuff back. Our current situation in Florida, they changed our recommendation, or the way we get to regionals a couple years ago. Every district, I believe, now has 19 teams in the top 8 get out. Last year it was the top 10, and it was kind of ridiculous. So many teams making it to the regional meet, so now they made it the top 8. But it's a situation that, if you go back even previously to that, it was, anywhere between 6 and 13 teams in a district, and our district only had 6 teams, so only 3 teams were advancing, and basically we had some of the best teams in the state there. We've got, there was one year when we actually finished 5th out of 6 teams, and if we had run those times at the state meet, we would have ended up being 15th that day. It was before our run of performances and getting to the state meet started. So it kind of depends on what your district situation is. I'm pretty comfortable with the group that I have, that if I hit them hard here the last week of pre-comp, they're still going to be fine for the district meet. You might have a different situation. When we had that really small district where a few number of teams got out, I had to treat districts a whole lot more seriously, and where I might have to have, this is the last week of pre-comp, and then, I might have to have 4 weeks of the competitive phase, and just I deal with what happens at the state meet, because you got to get there for the race to matter. It sort of depends on your situation. At regionals, obviously regionals are sort of the scariest meets of the year, because it decides if you get to districts, to states. This is sometimes called sectionals, depending on what state you're in, but regionals is directly qualifier for your state meet. Regionals, at least for us, now we're going to have 2 different districts times 8 teams, so we're going to have 16 teams again in the regionals, which is what it had been for a number of years, and the top 8 are going to get out. So it's still going to be, it's going to be half the teams that are going to get there, which is, obviously a little bit more of a difficulty than what it could be in certain situations. It's definitely a pressure cooking type of meet. So the idea being is you've kind of laid off them here for a little bit. Not laid off them, there's still hard work happening in the competitive phase, but the volume has dropped just a little bit, and to where they can really be hitting on all cylinders here, and definitely by the state meet. So that's sort of the timing. In the next couple of videos, what we'll do is we'll go through, and like I said, there's nothing really different with the workouts that are going to be going on here, but what I'll do is I'll go through maybe one video for, say, a 9-day cycle, and just kind of take you through what I would do in that first, 9-day cycle of pre-comp, and then the second 9-day cycle of pre-comp, throwing, meets and things like that in there too, that are obviously sort of important meets, but how can you deal with them so you don't have detraining and things like that? Because again, there's nothing new going on here, but I'll also point out, this will be the last time I recommend you do fly 30s, or this is the last time I recommend you do a tempo run, or something like that, as we go through it, since we're not really adding anything new, and I'll talk about sort of the changes to the workouts in those phases. And then we will get ourselves into the competitive phase, and we'll do some videos on the competitive phase, and then we'll get right to it. And then at the end, for those of you that maybe want to have a kid that gets ready for Foot Locker Nationals, Foot Locker Regionals, I know that Nike Regionals was canceled this year, but as of right now, Foot Locker is still on, and we may have a couple kids that might want to do that. And also here in Florida, the AAU National Cross Country Championship meet is going to be happening actually at FSU, hopefully, if everything goes according to plan. So depending on how things go, it might even be something that I might want to have my kids do, because it's not all that often that, the national meet for something like that's in your backyard. So after we get through the competitive phase, we'll look at, maybe what you could do to extend out your season if you do it the right way. Obviously, you can only peak so many times in a year, but how could you safely do it if you have a kid that wants to have a chance at doing Foot Locker regionals, maybe for their last high school race, and maybe there's a time in mind, or maybe you have something like a club meet or something like that that's near you that you might want to do, or maybe you have a team that's strong enough to get to teams don't get to Foot Locker Nationals, but maybe something like that, a kid that maybe can get to Foot Locker if they're top 10 in their regional or something like that. If, in a normal year, Nike does have team qualifiers and things, that's what we'll do sort of at the end here, and then hopefully, I'll have the energy, and I'll do the same type of thing for getting ready for the track season. So if you like this video, please think about liking or subscribing. Tons of videos I put in the description down below that I reference. Also, if you have questions or comments, please ask them in the comments down below. I really do enjoy going through those and answering them. It helps me better understand it myself, and hopefully I can help some people out with maybe something that's not as clear, help out for maybe a particular situation. As I mentioned, a couple of videos we'll be doing as we go through the different phases here. I'll probably do one video also just on Special Endurance 1 and 2 because they are the things we're really targeting and kind of take you through those in the next couple days. But until next time, this has been Coachy TV.